want to thank Pam for reading this morning. Linda has been off gallivanting some this summer, and she made a quick decision a couple of weeks ago, which she may regret, to make a turn up to the little town of Zebulon, North Carolina, near Raleigh, to check on her mom. So we're thinking about her mom and her this morning, and so I looked over at Pam and said, I realized that I took something back to the office and I grabbed this and that, but I grabbed everything but the sermon. And so this is one of those days I wished I did the 3 points in a poem thing, and I'd be better off. Wow. Last week we talked about a hard text. We talked about Jesus going over to the border and running into an intruder on the border. Someone who intruded into his private time, his time of refreshment, his time of relaxation. Why? Because she was frantic and concerned for her daughter. And in that transaction, you remember that she ended up having her needs met. Her daughter was healed. And also in that moment, Jesus was forced to face his upbringing, so to speak, and come to grips with the fact that those who had taught him, had nurtured him, might have missed a few things along the way. And as a result of the confrontation with this outsider from the other side of the border, Jesus came to see his mission in a much broader sense. Today, Jesus is back on track. He's back in the homeland. He was refreshed after the encounter with the uppity woman. He has learned something, and now he's on the road again, because Jesus seems to be always on the road again. It's like Jesus listened to Willie Nelson before Willie Nelson was. There have been conversations taking place, and finally Jesus turns, calls some disciples together and folk around, and he said, so, what are people saying? Somebody says, well, some people are saying you're maybe John the Baptist. Somebody says, well, other people are saying, you're Elijah, one of the truly great, courageous prophets. Somebody said, well, folk are saying you're one of the great prophets. Jesus decided enough about what they heard other people saying. Ask the question. This question of identity. Ask the people who were standing before him to state themselves clearly where they were. And so he says, yes, all right, but who do you say that I am? And in that minute, Peter steps up in his way, as Peter always does, and he blurts out, well, you're the Messiah. And so then Jesus, may have shaken his head, and then he looks at him, and I know Mark has him saying, don't tell anybody, but I think Jesus just probably shushed him, That's Mark's messianic secret thing as he's telling the story. Then Jesus steps out and begins talking about the journey ahead. And Jesus, in this text, has moved way beyond pragmatism. They may have started this story not knowing where they were going, and they may have fooled themselves about where they were going, and they may have had ambitions about where they were going, because when Peter uses the term Messiah, it already has political implications. But Jesus begins saying what no one wanted to hear. Well, you see, I'm going down the road, and here's how it's going to be. It's not going to end too well, because there are those, they're going to have their way, and when all is said and done, I'm going to be dead. And then I'll be back. At that point, good old tempestuous Peter steps in to save Jesus from himself. And now Peter tries to say, shh. And Jesus turns and looks at Peter and, at least metaphorically, cleans his clock. I mean, calling somebody Satan, that's a pretty heavy-handed thing to say, right? Yeah, somebody one time called me Satan, but I didn't take it in a flattering way. So now it's out there on the table. There's no secret to be kept. And Jesus furthermore says, if you're interested in saving your lives, be careful, because it may cost you your lives. If you're willing to lose your life, you may be absolutely amazed at what you may gain. I've heard this sermon preached all kinds of ways. Preached it myself a few times. And oftentimes it gets hung up at the very beginning with the identification of, who do you say that I am? Right? That confrontive question. And here's the thing, that throughout the ages, the church has done really badly with this. Because we keep thinking that we can come up with an answer that will suffice, that will make everybody comfortable, that will put the issue to rest. The folk with whom I grew up says, well, Jesus is the lamb, the perfect lamb that has to be satisfied to keep this mean-spirited God off of our backs. That's what I grew up with. There are others who will say, oh, well, Jesus was a great wisdom teacher. Oh, Jesus was a prophet. Jesus was. But here's what I found through the years, having pastored the United Church of Christ for a long, long time, that we are more prone than not to start telling someone who asks us that question, well, I tell you what I don't believe Jesus is. And we start by trying to define this Jesus in the negative. Well, Jesus is not this, and Jesus is not that, and Jesus certainly isn't this. I don't know about that. And we find ways to move around the question. And I think we do that honestly because my experience through the years of walking this journey is that Jesus is pretty elusive. Jesus makes it hard on anybody who's trying to discern who he was by reading the gospel writers. And when we look at the Gospels clearly, we, I think, realize that it's not about defining Jesus as whether or not we're willing to take the journey. Thus the title. 25 plus years ago, Maya Angelou published had a book published that she had written called Wouldn't Take Nothing from a Journey Now. Good book. Not probably one of her best, but good book. I immediately went out and bought it because the quartet that I was a part of in high school with my sister and a couple other folk, that was one of the songs that we sang over and over again. It was one of the more popular songs. kind of went into the verse of, wouldn't take nothing for my journey now. I got to make it to heaven somehow, though the devil tempts me and tries to turn me around. He's offered everything that's got a name, all the wealth I want, and worldly fame. If I could, still I wouldn't take nothing for my journey now. See, I remember that. When I get home, I'll ask Chris what I had for breakfast. It's the journey to which we have been called. Except for a few spots in the gospel, this being one of them, where Jesus is asking those who were following to identify who they think Jesus is. The truth is, Jesus is always on the move. He's always an instrument of healing. He's always doing the surprising things. He eats with the interesting people. He worries less about pragmatism than about pursuing the journey to which he's been called. And he says to those of us who claim to be followers, come on the journey. Follow the journey. And there's always the caveat that if you take the journey, it will be an incredibly exciting life, except it may not end as you anticipate it ending. My dad loved road trips. I do that to this day. Just take a road trip. The only problem is I don't do it the right way. I go to Google and I says, well, if I'm going to get here, I've got to go up to Sanford and I've got to go about this lake. And no. My dad didn't care about that stuff. There were pig trails all over the Appalachian Mountains. And my dad would leave and go. My mom would try to talk him into asking somebody where we were, but he wouldn't. He always waited till we get to needed gas. At least that's what he said. So we'd stop in those days at an old Gulf station. And, they used to give out maps at these stations. And he'd sneak, and I've seen him sneak around when Mom wasn't there to look on the map to actually try to find out where he was. It was the thrill of the journey. And in the journey, it was a thrill for us. It was an adventure. Right? We would sing along the way. We would see interesting sights. One night we came around the curve because we were running way too late because he was way too lost. And there, sitting in the middle of the road, was a huge black bear. No child could ever forget that. It was the thrill of the journey. Jesus is saying to those who hear the text today, pick up the cross, meaning what the journey is ultimately about, and come on. Jesus is not asking you to write an Apostles' Creed. Isn't asking you to define your faith down to the last letter. Saying, take up your cross and follow this way. The caveat, of course, is that the way of Jesus, no matter how you try to define it, is always the way that veers off where there are people who are vulnerable and people who are most oppressed and the poorest and the most objectivized and the most marginalized. I mean, I can't help how the story goes. That's the story. Where the greatest need is, you find Jesus. And if we're to take that journey, it may be uncomfortable at times, but it's how we ultimately gain our lives. See most clearly what's important. Who's important. And get a vision of what God is up to. Churches. Let's throw out the congregational aspect. The church. has always been more interested in chasing the rabbit of defining Jesus. I would suggest today that we break ranks and ask the question as a body, where is this taking us? And what will that look like? I bet it's going to be interesting. Don't you think?